I remember the first time I saw Mark. It was at a friend's birthday party. He was the center of attention, telling stories that made everyone laugh. I was mesmerized by his confidence. That's how it all started. Now, 3 years later, I'm sitting here in our small living room, 7 months pregnant, wondering where that charming man disappeared to. Daisy, did you see my blue shirt? Mark's voice breaks my train of thought. It's in the closet, where it always is, I reply, trying to get comfortable on the couch. He walks into the room, fumbling with his tie. I can't find it. Are you sure you didn't put it somewhere else? I sigh, slowly standing up. I'll get it for you. As I hand him the shirt, he gives me a quick, distracted smile. Thanks, Daisy. I don't know what I'd do without you. There's a hint of the old Mark in that smile, but it fades quickly. He's always been a bit forgetful, a bit dependent, but since we got married, it's like he's a different person. He expects me to remember everything, to take care of everything, just like his mom did for him. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, calls almost every day. She's nice enough, but her constant checking in can be a bit much. Daisy, dear, did you make sure Mark ate breakfast? You know how he gets when he's hungry, she would say. I used to find it endearing in a way, but now it's just another reminder of how much Mark relies on others. Mark is getting ready to leave for work, and I'm dreading another long day alone in the house. The baby kicks, and I place my hand on my belly, trying to find some comfort. Mark, do you think you could come home early today? I'm feeling a bit off, I say, hoping for some company. He glances at his watch, already halfway out the door. Sorry, Daisy. Big day at the office. You know how it is. Just rest up, okay? And with that, he's gone. I sit back down, feeling the weight of loneliness. I wonder if this is how it's going to be from now on. Me, at home, waiting for Mark to find his way back to the man he used to be. I look around the room, at the life we've built, and can't help but feel like it's all just a charming illusion. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, and I could already hear the familiar ring of the phone. I knew who it was without even looking. Morning, Daisy dear. Just checking in. Did Mark have his breakfast? And what about lunch? You know he doesn't like sandwiches. Mrs. Thompson's voice chirped through the receiver. I rubbed my temples, feeling the start of a headache. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Yes, he had breakfast. And I've packed him pasta for lunch. He won't go hungry. Oh, pasta again? You know, I always made sure he had a hot meal for lunch. Maybe you should try doing that. He loves my chicken casserole, she replied, her tone slightly critical. I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll keep that in mind. After the call, I made my way to the kitchen, feeling the baby kick. I leaned against the counter, thinking about how Mrs. Thompson always had a way of making me feel inadequate. I wasn't just competing with Mark's memories of her cooking, but with her constant presence in our life. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I opened the door to find Mrs. Thompson herself, standing there with a bag of groceries. Daisy, I brought you some things. I noticed you're running low on a few essentials, she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. I followed her, trying to mask my frustration. Thank you, but you really didn't need to. I don't mind, dear. And I noticed the house could use a bit of tidying up. You should be more careful, especially with the baby coming, she said, looking around with a critical eye. I felt a surge of anger. I'm doing my best, Mrs. Thompson. It's not easy being pregnant and managing the house all by myself. She clucked her tongue, unpacking the groceries. Well, when Mark was a child, I did everything without any help. It's all about managing your time better, dear. The rest of her visit went in a blur of unsolicited advice and thinly veiled criticisms. By the time she left, I was exhausted and more than a little resentful. Sitting alone in the now silent kitchen, I couldn't help but feel overshadowed by this woman who still held such a firm grip on her son. It was like I was living in a shadow, always trying to live up to an impossible standard. I knew something had to change, but right now, I felt too tired to even think about how to start. All I could do was sit there, feeling the weight of a mother's shadow over my life. As I maneuvered through the crowded aisles of the grocery store, each step felt heavier than the last. My back ached and my feet were swollen. I was halfway through my list when I realized I had forgotten bread. Turning back, I maneuvered past a sea of shopping carts, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Daisy, need a hand? It was Jim, Mark's dad, waving from the end of the aisle. His presence was like a breath of fresh air. I smiled, genuinely relieved. Jim, you're a lifesaver. I almost forgot the bread. We walked together, chatting about this and that. Jim had a way of making even mundane conversations feel comforting. As we reached the bread section, he joked, "Make sure it's whole grain. We've got to keep Mark away from that white bread fluff." I laughed, appreciating his lightheartedness. "I'll try, but you know how he is with his food preferences." Jim nodded, his expression turning a bit more serious. "Yeah, I do. He's always been a bit picky. Got that from his mother, I suppose." We moved towards the checkout, and I felt a sense of ease that was rare these days. Jim's presence was calming, a stark contrast to the constant tension I felt at home. "You know, Daisy," Jim began, as he helped me unload my cart, "I've been thinking. Maybe Mark and his mom are a bit hard on you. You're doing everything while carrying a little one. It's not fair." I was taken aback by his frankness. Well, I try to keep up. But it's hard, Jim. I feel like I'm always falling short of their expectations." Jim frowned. "You're doing more than enough. Don't let them tell you otherwise. You're carrying my grandchild, for heaven's sake." His words were like a balm to my weary soul. We finished checking out, and he insisted on helping me to the car. As he lifted a bag, he winced, his hand going to his lower back. "Jim, you're back," I began, concerned. He shrugged it off with a grin. "Ah, it acts up now and then. Nothing to worry about." But I could tell he was in pain. It pained me to see him strain himself for my sake. "You shouldn't be doing this, Jim. I can manage." He waved my concerns away. "Nonsense. Helping you is the least I can do. Besides, it keeps me active." We reached my car, and he carefully placed the bags in the trunk. "You head on home and rest. I'll have a talk with Mark and his mom. Things need to change." I thanked him, feeling a mix of gratitude and guilt. It was clear that Jim understood the dynamics at home better than anyone. As I drove away, I realized that without Jim, I would be truly alone in this struggle. His support meant the world to me, especially now. Back home, I put away the groceries, each item reminding me of Jim's kindness. His words echoed in my mind, giving me a sliver of hope. Perhaps, with his help, things could get better. Maybe, just maybe, Mark and his mother would start to see things from my perspective. But as the day wore on, and the house returned to its usual quiet, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Change was necessary, but it wouldn't come easy. I braced myself for the conversation that Jim would undoubtedly have with Mark and Mrs. Thompson. Whatever the outcome, I knew one thing for sure. Jim was my only ally in this, and I was grateful for him. The clock on the kitchen wall showed it was past midnight. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creaking of the floorboards. Mark wasn't home yet. His late nights were becoming more frequent, but tonight felt different. I tried to distract myself by tidying up, but my mind was racing. The sound of a car pulling up jolted me from my thoughts. I peeked through the window and saw Mark stumbling out of the car, clearly drunk. My heart sank. He fumbled with his keys at the door, cursing under his breath. When he finally managed to get inside, he looked at me with glazed eyes. "Mark, you're drunk," I said, my voice a mix of worry and frustration. He sneered. "Oh, now you're my mother? Keep your lectures to yourself, Daisy." I felt a knot in my stomach. "You promised you'd stop this. You know it's not good, especially now." He cut me off, his voice slurred but harsh. "Stop nagging me. I needed a break, okay? You don't know what it's like at work." I tried to reason with him. "But what about us, Mark? What about the baby?" He laughed, a cold, bitter sound. The baby. Is that all you can talk about? You used to be fun, Daisy. Now you're just boring." His words stung. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "And look at you. You've become a fat cow. What happened to the woman I married?" He jeered. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They streamed down my face as I turned away from him. Mark staggered to the bedroom, leaving me standing there, broken and alone. I cried myself to sleep on the couch that night. The next morning, I woke up to find Mark had already left for work. My eyes were swollen from crying, and every part of me felt heavy. There was a knock on the door. It was Jim, looking concerned. "Daisy, are you all right? I saw Mark's car outside last night. He didn't—" I couldn't hide the truth. "He came home drunk, Jim. He said things. Awful things." Jim's face hardened. "That boy has gone too far. I'm going to have a word with him." "No, Jim, please. It'll only make things worse," I pleaded. He sighed, his anger giving way to sadness. "You shouldn't have to go through this, Daisy, especially not now." I felt a mix of gratitude and despair. Jim was the only one who seemed to care, but I was starting to feel like there was no way out of this mess. The house felt like a prison, and I was trapped with my broken dreams and a husband who couldn't see past his own needs. As Jim left, he gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Hang in there, Daisy. We'll figure something out." But as I closed the door behind him, I wasn't so sure. The night had broken something inside me, and I didn't know if it could be fixed. Time seemed to slip away, and before I knew it, I was in the final stretch of my pregnancy. 9 months had flown by, and the reality of soon becoming a mother weighed heavily on me. I needed support more than ever. One evening, as Mark and I sat in our dimly lit living room, I mustered up the courage to ask him a question that had been on my mind for weeks. "Mark, my due date is approaching. I was thinking, maybe you could take some time off to be with me." "To help out when the baby comes," I said, trying to sound hopeful. He barely looked up from his phone. "Time off? Now?" "Daisy, you know how busy I am at work. I can't just leave." I felt a pang of disappointment. "But this is important, Mark. It's our first child. I need you here." He sighed, his impatience growing. "You'll manage. Women do this all the time." His words stung, but before I could respond, he stood up. "Anyway, there's something else. Mom and we're going on a trip next week. She found this great package deal." I stared at him, disbelief and anger building inside me. "A trip? With your mother? But you just said you couldn't take time off." He shrugged, dismissive. "That's different. It's already planned and paid for. Mom's been looking forward to this." I couldn't contain my frustration. "So, a vacation with your mother is more important than being here for your wife and child?" Mark's tone hardened. "I don't need this, Daisy. It's just a week. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" "A big deal? I'm about to give birth, Mark. I asked you for help, for support, and you're abandoning me for a holiday?" He rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed. "You're overreacting. It's not like I'm leaving forever. You'll be fine." I stood up, my voice shaking with anger. "Fine? You think I'll be fine? You're choosing a vacation over your family, over your child. Do you even care?" He grabbed his coat, ready to leave the room. "I'm not doing this now. You're being irrational. I'm going." I watched him walk away, my heart sinking. The man I married, the man who promised to be by my side, was leaving me alone at the most crucial time. And for what? A leisure trip with his mother. It was the day of Mark and his mother's departure. The house was a flurry of last-minute packing and hushed, excited chatter. I was in the kitchen, trying to keep myself busy, when I felt a sudden, sharp pain. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. My water had broken. Staggering into the living room, where Mark and his mother were grabbing their suitcases, I gasped, "Mark, my water broke. We need to go to the hospital." Mark glanced at me, his face a mask of annoyance. "Now? Daisy, we're about to leave. Can't it wait?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Wait? I'm in labor, Mark." He looked at his mother, then back at me, his decision clear. "I can't miss this flight. Mom's been looking forward to this." With that, he and his mother hurried out the door, leaving me alone, in pain and in shock. Panicking, I called Jim. "Jim, it's Daisy. The baby's coming, and Mark, he left." Jim's voice was a mix of anger and worry. "Left? That boy? I'm coming right now, Daisy. Hang in there." Minutes later, Jim arrived, his face flushed from rushing. He helped me into the car, despite his sciatica. "We'll get you to the hospital, Daisy. Just breathe." As we drove, my phone rang. It was Mark, his voice frantic. "Daisy, you have to send our documents to the airport. We forgot them because of your damn timing." I was in disbelief, struggling through a contraction. Mark, I'm about to give birth. How can you think about your documents now? He was relentless. Just do it, Daisy. This is your fault. If you hadn't distracted us... I hung up, tears of frustration and pain streaming down my face. Jim reached over, squeezing my hand. Ignore him, Daisy. Just focus on yourself and the baby. We arrived at the hospital, and I was rushed into the delivery room. Jim stayed by my side, his presence a comforting contrast to Mark's absence. In those long, painful hours, I realized the stark truth about my marriage. Mark's priorities were clear, and they didn't include me or our child. But in the midst of that painful revelation, I found strength in Jim's unwavering support, and in the knowledge that I wasn't completely alone. As I held my newborn son for the first time, a wave of love and determination washed over me. I knew then that my life was about to change dramatically, but looking into my son's eyes, I felt ready to face whatever came our way. The first few days with my newborn son were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming emotions. I was still reeling from the shock of Mark's absence during the birth. Jim had been my rock, helping me through the initial days at the hospital and then at home. It was during one of those sleep-deprived mornings when Mark finally showed up, his mother in tow. The moment I saw them, my heart sank. "Mark, you're back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, well, the trip was a bust, thanks to you," he replied, his tone cold and accusatory. I held my son closer, trying to keep my composure. "Mark, this is your son. Don't you want to hold him?" He glanced at the baby, then away, his disinterest clear. "Sure, later. We need to talk about the mess you caused." His mother chimed in, her voice sharp. "You've been nothing but trouble, Daisy. You couldn't even manage to send simple documents." I felt a surge of anger. "I was giving birth, for heaven's sake. How could you both be so heartless?" Mark scoffed. "Heartless? You're the one who ruined our trip. You could have waited or called someone else." Jim, who had been silent until then, finally spoke up. "Mark, that's enough. You're talking nonsense. Daisy needed you, and you abandoned her." Mark turned to his father, defiant. "Oh, so now you're taking her side? She's turned you against me." Jim's expression was one of disappointment and anger. "It's not about sides, Mark. It's about doing the right thing. You failed Daisy and your son." The room was thick with tension, and I felt my son stir in my arms. "I can't believe this is happening," I said, my voice breaking. Mark's mother stepped forward, pointing a finger at me. "You've always been a problem, Daisy. I knew from the start you weren't right for our family." I looked at her, then at Mark, feeling a mix of sadness and resolve. "I may not have been what you wanted, but I tried. I tried for Mark, for our family. But it's clear now I was fighting a losing battle." Mark looked away, his expression unreadable. Jim put his hand on my shoulder, giving me a reassuring squeeze. "Daisy, you don't deserve this. You and your son deserve so much better." As I looked down at my baby, his innocent eyes staring back at me, I knew Jim was right. I couldn't raise my son in a home where his father resented his existence and where his grandmother saw me as an enemy. "I need to think about the future," I said, more to myself than to anyone else in the room. Mark and his mother left shortly after, their departure leaving a cold silence in their wake. Jim stayed, helping me with the baby, his presence a reminder that not all hope was lost. In the weeks that followed, the house felt different, heavier, like the air was thick with unsaid things. I spent my days caring for my son, each smile and giggle from him a balm to my weary heart. But the shadow of the unresolved with Mark loomed over us. One afternoon, Jim came over, a serious look on his face. We sat in the living room, my son asleep in his crib. "Daisy, I've been thinking," Jim started, his voice heavy. "This situation, it's not right. You and the baby deserve better." I nodded, the weight of my decision clear in my mind. "I know, Jim, I can't stay in this marriage. It's not healthy for me or my son." Jim reached out, taking my hand. "I support you, Daisy. And there's more. I've decided to change my will. I'm setting up a trust fund for your son, my grandson. Mark. He's not the man I hoped he'd be." I was taken aback. Jim, you don't have to do that. He shook his head firmly. I do. It's the right thing. Mark needs to learn there are consequences for his actions. The next day, Mark and his mother came over. The tension was palpable. Daisy, we need to talk, Mark said, avoiding eye contact. I stood my ground, holding my son. There's not much to talk about, Mark. I've decided to file for divorce. His mother gasped. Divorce? You're tearing this family apart, Jim intervened. No, she's doing what's best for her and the baby, and I'm supporting her. Mark, I'm changing my will. Your son will be taken care of. Mark turned to his father, disbelief and anger in his eyes. You're siding with her? Over your own son? Jim's response was firm. It's not about sides, Mark. It's about responsibility, something you've avoided. The room erupted into arguments, with Mark and his mother on one side and me, holding my son, on the other. Jim stood with me, his presence a steady force. In the end, Mark and his mother left, their parting words bitter and resentful. Jim stayed, helping me plan the next steps. As I filed the divorce papers, I felt a sense of liberation mixed with sadness. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was a life where my son and I could be free of the toxicity that had engulfed us. Days turned into weeks, and the finality of the divorce brought a strange sense of peace. Jim was true to his word. The trust fund he set up for my son ensured our future was secure. And so I began to build a new life, one filled with hope and the laughter of my son. There were challenges, of course, but I faced them with a newfound strength. As I put my son to bed one night, I whispered a promise to him. We're going to be okay, just you and me, a fresh start. And in the quiet of his room, with the soft sound of his breathing, I believed it.